Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order, the latest game from developer Respawn and EA's first single-player Star Wars game since forever, is now called by some perhaps to be the best Star Wars game of all time. But is it really? Well, that's something difficult to answer, or really even give a ballsy statement like that, especially considering all the different genres of Star Wars games. So before we get into that, let's dig into the basics of Jedi Fallen Order. Story-wise, it's fairly straightforward. You play as Cal Kestis, a Padawan living in secret during the Imperial era, 5 years after Order 66. Eventually, Cal is found out by the Empire and then is chased down by the Inquisitors, which then sees him travel from planet to planet not only in an effort to survive, but also grow as a Jedi in an attempt to revive the Order. The gameplay is that of an action-adventure game, designed for players to jump into situations and deal with it with your lightsaber and force powers. The combat itself is best described as careful, as you'll often find yourself needing to anticipate your opponent's moves with the right timing in order to get out of encounters alive. This is especially true if you end up playing the game on the higher difficulties. As for the feel of the gameplay in general, it seems like a mix of different elements taken from Uncharted, God of War, and Dark Souls, all with a Star Wars skin. But does it excel in anything from those games? Then probably not. I can't speak for the others, but as an Uncharted fan, I found Fallen Order often trying to mimic its gameplay. Like in the first planet Bogano, where it was especially Uncharted heavy, but it just ended up feeling inferior, which I can only assume might be the same case for the other games too. I'll explain later in the cons portion of this review on why this was exactly the case, at least for me. But before we get there, I feel I should be brutally honest in this review, and you know what? I borderline almost hated this game when I first started playing it. Now, a quick background on me as a gamer, I'm more of a strategy and RTS kind of player. Games like Company of Heroes 2 are my bread and butter, and I rarely ever have the patience or time to finish single-player adventure games. I think I've only ever completed 5 single-player games in my lifetime, being Mass Effect 2 and 3, Uncharted 4, Red Dead Redemption 1, and Witcher 3. At least those are the ones off the top of my head. But yeah, it takes a real special game to get me locked in from start to finish. And when I started playing Fallen Order on PC, for whatever reason, I just wasn't feeling it. It seemed janky, unintuitive, too over the top, and kind of boring. I felt this way through the tutorial level on Braca and the first planet Bogano. And honestly, at that point, I was seriously considering on giving up on the game. Fortunately, I convinced myself to give the game another chance. I plugged in a controller this time, started playing on the second planet Zepho, and whoa, it's almost like it became a completely different game and experience at that point. I went from hating my time with the game to really enjoying it. It's evident that the game was designed with a controller in mind, and playing it with a mouse and keyboard was such a pain, at least for me. So with that said, I highly recommend every PC player to play this with a controller to really truly experience what the developers had intended. Suffice to say, I'm very glad I gave the game a second chance, as I could had easily missed out. Granted, while the game did become a lot of fun and enjoyable, it's far from perfect, and I think with that, we'll start with the negatives of Fallen Order first, and then end off with the positives. First negative that comes to mind is poor optimization and performance. Having played this on a high-end rig, I found myself getting annoying and somewhat constant FPS drops, especially on busy planets like Kashyyyk. This shouldn't be an issue of a properly optimized game, so I was surprised Respawn released Fallen Order in this kind of state. As for graphics, I found them to be a hit or miss. They looked amazing in some parts like cinematics, character models, and planets like Dathomir for example, while in other parts looked either last gen or an entirely different game altogether, such as the artwork style and textures of Bogano or the Wookiees. Yeah, they were pretty rough looking in this game. Speaking of Bogano, I thought it was a bad idea to have that be the starting planet. And after beating the game, it's still my least liked planet to visit and play on. It's small, boring, and more complicated than it should be. I feel like that could be a turnoff for some players like it did for me, which is a shame because every other planet after Bogano is amazing. So yeah, not a fan of Bogano. Controlling Cal also feels somewhat clunky and nowhere near as smooth or fluid like for example Nathan Drake in Uncharted 4. This along with the FPS drops I mentioned before and playing on Bogano really deterred me from having a positive start to the game. Fortunately, the game really picks off once you do get to Zepho, but even then, Cal's controls and awkward movement still remain. When it comes to character customization, Fallen Order continues to disappoint, with the only customization available to Cal being different color ponchos and palette changes to his suit. Customizing my character's appearance is always one of my favorite things to do in single-player games, and I can't say I was thrilled to see this feature largely ignored here. Basically, you're forced to play as a space construction worker all through the game, and to see such limited customization options in a 2019 game feels lazy. The game also lacks a proper endgame, which results in little to no replay value. You can't replay boss fights or even the final level for that matter, which some could argue is one of the best in the game. There also isn't anything new to find or do when finishing the game too, other than going back and opening the loot boxes that you missed during your first playthrough. And if that isn't something you care too much about, then there's hardly any reason to continue playing your current save file. Personally, I think if Respawn really didn't want to do an endgame where you can revisit any level or maybe unlock the Inquisitor appearance, then they should have at the very least added a battle arena where you can face hordes of enemies or maybe do one-on-one lightsaber battles. If not that, then a multiplayer mode would have been pretty cool, which now that I think about it, kinda feels like a missed opportunity now, as that would essentially make this the next generation Jedi Outcast, and that game had an amazing multiplayer for the time. Instead, it feels more like a modern Force Unleashed, a one and done single player campaign and that's it. Now I also feel I should say that this game is somewhat puzzle heavy, so if you're like me and don't care for that sort of thing, then you'll find yourself getting frustrated with them from time to time. For the most part, they're okay and sometimes even fun, but there are a few puzzles in there that should have definitely been either done differently or removed altogether. Oh, and there also isn't any fast travel, so expect long playthroughs into the level and then sometimes even back to your ship. Alright, with all the negatives out of the way, it's time to look at the positives of Fallen Order. First and foremost, where I need to give props to the game is the incredible immersive experience it gives you. You notice this right from the get-go, and it only gets better from there. I can't think of much other games that provide this high level of attention to detail and immersing you in the Star Wars universe. My favorite little thing that took me by surprise is when taking down ATST walkers, as sometimes you'll get the ATST drivers actually climb out and fight you. That's something I've never seen done in any other Star Wars game before, so yeah, it's a small detail but I loved it. The cinematics are also on point, which at times almost make you feel like you're watching a movie or a Star Wars Disney Plus show. I kind of wish there was a way to rewatch cinematics in the game because I would have liked to see some of them again just because of how well they were done and exciting they were. Oh, and the soundtrack? Absolute perfection. Gordy Hab has outdone himself with the music in Fallen Order, which sounds like all new original material, but also has bits and pieces clearly inspired from John Williams' A New Hope soundtrack. The story itself here isn't amazing, but it isn't bad either. I did like the introduction of the Zepho race, as well their history with the Force, and there were some neat twists in the story that do keep you on your toes. Along with that, I do appreciate how even though the game does take place during the Imperial era, there are flashbacks that take you back to Order 66, which I thought was a nice touch. As then there is something in this game that both prequel and original trilogy fans can enjoy. Although I can't say I was crazy about the ending, as it seemed like a retread from a particular fight from Rebels Season 2. But with that, it's obvious that Respawn are interested in making this game into a series, which I do hope the sales for Fallen Order do come out good because I'd love to see a sequel for sure. Now, there are only 5 planets you could really visit throughout your playthrough, including the final boss level, but they're all really fun to play on, with the exception of Bogano. My personal favorite was Dathomir. Even though I did get lost there at times and there were some parts that did get me frustrated a bit, I still ended up having the most fun there and looked forward each time I had to travel to Dathomir. I don't know why, but there's just something special about Dathomir in this game. Maybe it's the look and feel of the environment, the unique enemies you face, or the Night Sister always watching your every move. Either way, it's good stuff. The combat in Fallen Order is for sure what's going to keep a lot of people invested in the game, and thankfully it delivers. While there are only 3 force powers in total that Cal can use, which are Force Pull, Push, and Slow, I think that's a decent amount to have in the first game, especially for a Padawan. Each of them can be quite useful in battle depending on who you're facing, and are fully utilized in level exploration, especially if you want to discover all the secret areas and loot boxes hidden on the maps. The lightsaber play, on the other hand, feels amazing once you get a feel for it. I can't say it beats the lightsaber combat from the Jedi Outcast games, but it does a good job here for what it is. And on the topic of the lightsaber, but we also have to give props to Respawn on the lightsaber customization here. Even though they criminally dropped the ball with character customization, they did, however, a fantastic job in allowing you to make a unique looking lightsaber. You get to pick your own emitter, switch, sleeve, and material. And from what I've heard, most of the custom pieces here are exactly the same ones used in Savi's workshop in Galaxy's Edge. So if you made a lightsaber there in real life, you should be able to recreate it here in the game, which is pretty cool. Game length is surprisingly long for what the game is. In my own playthrough, I clocked in about 16 hours of play according to Origin. Although 4 hours of that was probably me running around trying to figure out puzzles through trial and error, but still. I kinda feel there should still be one more planet to explore, not only to improve the game length, but as well give Marin something more to do. Because it just feels that once she does show up, the game is practically over, which seems a bit of a waste on such an awesome character. Lastly, I can't speak too much about the difficulty as I played on the easier level, but I do like how much difficulty choices the game does offer, especially on the hardest level, which makes Fallen Order feel like a Star Wars version of Dark Souls. So anyone who loves those type of games and really wants to challenge themselves, then they will for sure like this. Overall, Jedi Fallen Order is just plain fun, and I think that's all that really matters here at the end of the day. And if a game is fun, then it's so much easier to look past all its flaws. I mean, sure, the beginning of the game may not be fun for everyone, but if you soldier through it, then you'll be rewarded with a great immersive Star Wars adventure. As for the question on whether this is the best Star Wars game in history, probably not. But then again, I think that largely depends on what type of gamer you are. Is it the best Star Wars game I've ever played? Nope. But it could without a doubt be yours. N7 signing off.